Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. In the desolate Arizona desert, Officer Thaddeus Kern was looking at himself in the rearview mirror when he began to hear whispers coming from the radio. It was midnight, and he was facing a terrifying situation. His hair stood on end, and his body temperature began to drop. With every breath he took, there was a cold air that made his bones ache. "Unit 7, this is dispatch," came the voice of Mildred Good, the night dispatcher who'd been working these shifts longer than most officers had been alive. Her voice carried that particular weariness that came from too many years of sending officers into the darkness and waiting to hear they'd made it back safely. "We've got a domestic disturbance call out near Coyote Springs. Remote location, about 40 miles northeast of your current position." Thaddeus reached for the radio, his breath visible in the cold air despite the heater running full blast. The cruiser's interior smelled of old coffee and the pine air freshener hanging from the mirror, a futile attempt to mask the deeper smells that seemed to permeate every patrol vehicle. "Copy that, dispatch. Address?" "It's the old Pike residence, Vernon Pike. His neighbor called it in, said they heard shouting and what might have been breaking glass. Neighbor's place is about 3 miles away, so they must have been pretty loud for anyone to hear." There was a pause, and when Mildred spoke again, her voice carried something else, something like concern. "Thaddeus, be careful out there. The Pikes, they're different." The name Vernon Pike sent a small chill through Thaddeus that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd heard stories about the Pike family from other officers during shift changes and late-night conversations at the station. Nothing criminal exactly, just strange. They kept to themselves in that old Hogan conversion out in the middle of nowhere. Rarely came to town, and when they did, people crossed the street to avoid them. There were whispers about the family, about things that happened out at their place, about why no one ever visited them anymore. "Unit 7 responding," Thaddeus said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "ETA approximately 45 minutes. Copy that. Be advised, we're having some weather system interference tonight. Radio communications might be spotty out that way. Check in every 10 minutes if you can." "Understood." The drive out took him through some of the most desolate terrain in the reservation. The headlights carved through darkness so complete it felt like driving through the void itself. No other cars, no lights from distant homes, just the endless stretch of dirt road and the occasional glimpse of a jackrabbit darting across the path, eyes glowing green in the headlights before disappearing into the sagebrush. The mountains loomed on either side, black shapes against a slightly less black sky, stars hidden behind clouds that promised snow but never delivered. About 30 minutes into the drive, the radio started cutting in and out. Static bursts interrupted Mildred's periodic check-ins, her voice becoming increasingly distorted until, finally, nothing but white noise filled the cabin. Thaddeus tried adjusting the frequency, tried the backup channels, even tried his cell phone, though he knew there were no towers out here. Nothing worked. He was in a dead zone, completely cut off from the outside world. The last 10 miles to the Pike residence were the worst. The road deteriorated from poorly maintained gravel to something that could barely be called a path. The cruiser bounced and rattled over rocks and through ruts that seemed designed to destroy suspensions. Thaddeus had to slow to barely 10 miles per hour, and even then, he could hear concerning scrapes from the undercarriage. The Pike residence appeared suddenly in his headlights, materializing from the darkness like something conjured rather than built. It was a structure that seemed to grow out of the desert itself. Part traditional Hogan, part modern addition, creating an awkward architectural hybrid that looked wrong somehow, like two different time periods forced together against their will. The traditional part was made of logs and earth, the way the old ones built them, while the addition was cheap vinyl siding and aluminum windows, already showing signs of decay despite being only a few years old. A single light burned in what looked like the kitchen window, a sickly yellow glow that made the shadows around it seem darker by comparison. The wind had picked up, sending tumbleweeds rolling across the yard and making a metal gate somewhere creak rhythmically, like a metronome keeping time for a song no one could hear. Thaddeus parked about 20 yards from the house and sat for a moment, observing. The training kicked in automatically. Assess the scene, look for threats, plan your approach. No movement inside that he could see through the lit window. No vehicles in the driveway except an old pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in years. Its tires half buried in sand, rust eating through the wheel wells like cancer. A children's swing set stood off to one side, the swings moving slightly in the wind, chains squeaking with each movement. He stepped out of the cruiser, the cold air hitting him like a physical force. The desert in November was a different world from the desert in summer. The cold seemed to creep through every gap in his uniform, finding skin and chilling it instantly. His hand instinctively went to his service weapon, not drawing it, but finding comfort in its presence. The weight of it on his hip was reassuring, a reminder that he wasn't completely helpless out here in the darkness. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the desert wind. Each movement caused it to creak, a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet night. As he approached, Thaddeus noticed something dark on the doorframe. He pulled out his flashlight, clicked it on. Blood. A handprint. Fingers splayed wide as if someone had grabbed the frame for support. "Navajo Tribal Police," Thaddeus called out, his voice carrying into the darkness beyond the door. "Vernon Pike? This is Officer Kern. I'm responding to a disturbance call." No answer. Just the sound of that door creaking on its hinges and somewhere deeper in the house, a dripping sound. Steady. Rhythmic. Like a leaky faucet, but somehow wrong. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. Through the gap in the door he could see into the house. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of chaos, overturned furniture, broken dishes on the floor catching the light like scattered stars. And on the wall, more blood. Not just handprints, but long smears as if someone had been dragged along it. "Mr. Pike?" he called again, louder this time. "Is anyone hurt? I'm coming in to check on you." Still no response. Thaddeus pushed the door open with his shoulder, keeping his hand on his weapon. The smell hit him immediately. A combination of copper and something else, something organic and wrong. It was the smell of violence, of fear, of things that shouldn't be exposed to air. The living room was destroyed. It looked like a tornado had torn through it, but tornadoes didn't leave blood on the walls. The coffee table was split in half, the break jagged and violent. The television was face down on the floor, its screen shattered, reflecting his flashlight in 1,000 pieces. Family photos had been torn from the walls, some ripped in half, others ground into the carpet by heavy boots. A woman's shoe, just one, lay near the hallway entrance, and Thaddeus noticed with a chill that there was blood on it too. A sound from deeper in the house made him freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, shuffling rather than walking. They came from the hallway that led to the bedrooms, each step accompanied by a wet sound, like someone walking in soaked shoes. "Vernon Pike?" Thaddeus called out, drawing his weapon now. "I need you to show yourself with your hands visible." The footsteps stopped. Then a voice, rough and strained, barely human. "You shouldn't have come here." Vernon Pike emerged from the hallway like something from a nightmare. He was a large man, maybe 6'4", his frame filling the narrow passage. He wore a torn flannel shirt that might have once been blue, but was now mostly dark with blood. His face was gaunt, cheeks hollow, eyes sunken so deep they looked like black holes in his skull. Those eyes were wild, unfocused, looking at Thaddeus but also through him, as if seeing something else entirely. In his right hand, he held a hunting knife, the blade at least 8 inches long. It was covered in blood, some dried, some still wet enough to drip onto the floor. His left hand hung at an odd angle, clearly broken, fingers bent in directions they shouldn't go. "Drop the knife," Thaddeus commanded, his weapon trained on Vernon's center mass. His finger rested on the trigger guard, ready to move if needed. "Drop it now." Vernon looked at the knife as if seeing it for the first time, tilting his head like a curious dog. "She made me do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Each word seemed to cost him effort, as if speaking was painful. She wouldn't stop talking, wouldn't stop telling me things. Who made you do what?" Thaddeus kept his weapon steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Where is she? Is someone hurt?" Vernon laughed, a sound that made Thaddeus's skin crawl. It wasn't a human laugh, not really. It was the sound of someone who had crossed some invisible line and couldn't find their way back. "Hurt? She can't be hurt anymore, but she won't stop talking. Even now, she's talking. Can't you hear her? I need you to drop the knife and get on your knees," Thaddeus said firmly, using his command voice, the one they taught at the academy. "We can sort this out, but I need you to comply." Vernon took a step forward, his broken hand swinging uselessly at his side. "Do you hear her? She's talking to you now, too. She says you're not supposed to be here. This is family business, private business, old business. Vernon, I'm warning you. Drop the weapon." Another step. The knife glinted in the beam of Thaddeus's flashlight. Vernon's eyes never blinked, never looked away. "She says you have to leave now, before it's too late, before she tells you the secrets. She loves telling secrets." Thaddeus's finger moved to the trigger. "This is your last warning." Vernon suddenly lunged forward with surprising speed for such a large man. His movement was animalistic, predatory. Thaddeus fired twice, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash lit up Vernon's face for a split second, revealing an expression of almost relief. Vernon stumbled, dropped to one knee. 2 red stains spreading across his shirt, one center mass, one slightly to the right. But he didn't fall. He looked down at the wounds with something almost like curiosity, touching one with his broken hand, bringing the fingers up to look at the blood. "Finally," he whispered. "Finally, she'll be quiet." He collapsed forward, the knife clattering across the floor and spinning until it came to rest against the overturned coffee table. Thaddeus kept his weapon trained on him as he approached, kicked the knife further away, and checked for a pulse. Weak, thready, but there. Vernon was still alive, though probably not for long without medical attention. He grabbed his radio, tried to call for backup and medical, but still nothing but static. The sound filled the room, and for a moment, Thaddeus could have sworn he heard something in it. A voice whispering, but when he concentrated, it was just white noise. He had to clear the house. If there was someone else hurt, they needed help. Standard procedure, room by room, checking corners, checking closets. He moved down the hallway Vernon had emerged from, his flashlight sweeping left and right. The walls here were covered in more than just blood. There were words written in what looked like charcoal or ash, maybe both. They were in Navajo, old words, words his grandmother might have known, but that Thaddeus could only partially understand. Something about earth, about burial, about things that should stay down. The first bedroom was empty, undisturbed. A child's room by the look of it, though no child had slept there in years. Dust covered everything like a shroud. Toys sat abandoned on shelves, their plastic eyes catching his flashlight beam and seeming to follow him as he moved. The second room was clearly Vernon's. The smell of unwashed clothes and stale alcohol permeated everything. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled and stained. Empty bottles littered the floor, some broken, leaving glass shards that crunched under his boots. On the nightstand was a photo, old and yellowed, of Vernon with a woman. They were both younger, smiling, normal-looking. The woman had kind eyes. The third door was different. It had been modified. A padlock had been installed on the outside, recently by the looks of the fresh wood shavings on the floor. The wood around it was splintered as if someone had tried to break out from the inside. There were scratches on the door, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. Thaddeus's stomach turned. He went back to Vernon's still form, trying not to look at the spreading pool of blood beneath him. Vernon's breathing was shallow, rattling. Thaddeus searched his pockets, finding keys, a wallet, and something else. A small cassette recorder, the old kind from the 80s. He pocketed it and used the keys to open the padlock. The smell that escaped when he opened the door was overwhelming. Death. Decay. Something that had been rotting in a confined space. He had to turn away, gagging, eyes watering. When he could breathe again, he raised his flashlight and looked inside. The room had been converted into a prison. The windows were boarded up from the inside. The walls were covered in more writing, but this was different. This was neat, organized, the same phrase repeated hundreds of times in small, precise handwriting. He won't let me stop talking. In the center of the room was a chair. In the chair was what remained of a woman. She had been dead for days, maybe a week. The decomposition was advanced, skin mottled and bloated. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the speakers. There were a dozen small speakers placed around the room. Old computer speakers, the kind from the 90s. They were all connected with a tangle of wires to an old cassette player that sat on a milk crate. The player was still running, the cassette inside turning slowly. Thaddeus could hear a faint hiss from the speakers, and underneath it, barely audible, a voice. He approached it carefully, trying not to look at the body, trying not to breathe through his nose. The cassette player was ancient, held together with duct tape. He hit the stop button, and silence flooded the room. A silence so complete it felt like pressure on his eardrums. He looked at the body again, forcing himself to be clinical, to observe like a cop and not just a horrified human being. She was wearing what had once been a white nightgown, now stained beyond recognition. Her wrists were bound to the chair arms with zip ties, so tight they'd cut into the flesh. Her ankles were similarly bound to the chair legs. This wasn't suicide. This was murder. A sound behind him made him spin, weapon raised. Nothing. The doorway was empty. But he could have sworn he'd heard breathing. Close, like someone standing right behind him. He backed out of the room quickly, his mind reeling. He needed to get to his car, drive until he got radio signal, call this in. But when he returned to the living room, Vernon was gone. Only a blood trail remained, leading from where he'd fallen to the back door, which now stood open, cold wind blowing through it. Thaddeus followed, weapon drawn, flashlight sweeping. The blood trail was clear in the beam, dark droplets and smears on the old linoleum, then on the concrete steps leading down from the back door, then in the dirt beyond. It led out into the desert, clearly visible against the pale sand. He followed for maybe 50 yards, his flashlight beam getting weaker as he moved away from the house. The trail led straight as an arrow. No wandering, no stumbling, just a direct line into the darkness. And then it stopped. Not gradually, not as if the bleeding had stopped. It just ended, as if Vernon had simply ceased to exist mid-step. Thaddeus turned in a slow circle, flashlight and weapon sweeping the darkness. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, sagebrush and cacti creating shadows that could hide anything, or anyone. "Vernon!" he called out. "Vernon Pike!" Only the wind answered, bringing with it the smell of sage and something else, something like copper and rot. He backed toward the house, keeping his light moving, searching for any sign of movement. Every shadow could be Vernon. Every sound could be footsteps. The house loomed behind him, that single kitchen light still burning, looking like a yellow eye watching him retreat. Back at his cruiser, he tried the radio again. Still static, but different now. It seemed to pulse, to have a rhythm to it. And underneath, he could swear he heard that voice again, the same one from the cassette player in that horrible room. A woman's voice, soft, endless, talking about things that didn't make sense. He started the engine and drove, faster than was safe on these roads, the cruiser bouncing and sliding on the loose gravel. 5 miles. The static on the radio began to clear, and finally, blessed relief, Mildred's voice came through. "Unit 7, this is dispatch. We've been trying to reach you for the past hour. What's your status?" "Mildred," Thaddeus said, his voice shaking slightly. "I need backup and a crime scene unit at the Pike residence. Officer involved shooting. 1 subject down, whereabouts unknown. 1 deceased on scene, been dead for several days." There was a pause. "Say again, Unit 7. Did you say whereabouts unknown?" "The suspect left the scene on foot after being shot. Blood trail ends about 50 yards from the house. No sign of him." He paused, tried to think of how to explain what he'd seen. "The scene it's bad, Mildred. Really bad." "Understood. Units are en route. ETA 30 minutes. Are you injured?" "Negative, but Vernon Pike is missing. He was shot twice, center mass, but he got up and walked out. I lost his trail in the desert." "Copy that. Do you need medical for yourself?" "No, I'm okay. Just get them here fast." Thaddeus sat in his cruiser on the side of the road, engine running, doors locked. He kept checking his mirrors, expecting to see Vernon Pike shambling out of the darkness, knife in hand, that terrible smile on his face. But nothing came, just the darkness and the wind and the static on the radio that sometimes sounded like voices. He remembered the cassette recorder in his pocket and pulled it out. It was old, the kind that used microcassettes. There was a tape inside. His finger hovered over the play button, but something stopped him. Not here, not alone in the dark. He put it back in his pocket. When backup arrived, they found the house exactly as Thaddeus had described. The deceased woman was Vernon's sister, according to the mail they found. Her name was Margaret Pike, 43 years old, unemployed. She had been dead for at least a week, maybe longer. The medical examiner said she'd died of dehydration, slowly, painfully. The zip ties had been applied while she was alive. The cassette player contained a tape of her voice, recorded years ago, reading from what appeared to be a diary. The entries were disturbing, talking about family secrets, about things their father had done, about bodies buried in the desert, about voices in the walls of the old Hogan. The tape had been set to loop, playing endlessly in that room with her corpse. They never found Vernon Pike. The blood trail ended exactly where Thaddeus said it would, in the middle of nothing. Search teams combed the desert for days. Helicopters flew grid patterns. Dogs were brought in but lost the scent at the same spot. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist at that exact point. The amount of blood suggested he should have died within minutes of leaving the house. The medical examiner said it was impossible for him to have walked even 10 yards, let alone 50. But the evidence was clear. The trail was there, and then it wasn't. The investigation cleared Thaddeus of any wrongdoing. Justified shooting, the review board said. He'd followed procedure, defended himself against an armed suspect. But they couldn't explain how a man with 2 bullets in his chest could walk away and disappear into thin air. The cassette recorder Thaddeus had found contained something different. Not Margaret's voice, but Vernon's, recorded recently, maybe days before the incident. He talked about his sister, about how she wouldn't stop talking about the past, about things better left buried. He talked about the voices in the walls, how they'd gotten louder since she'd started talking. He talked about making her stop, about how he'd tried everything else first. The tape ended with him saying, "She won't stop talking. Even after she's dead, she won't stop talking. I can hear her. She's telling me things. She's telling me what I have to do." Thaddeus transferred to a different district 3 months later. He cited personal reasons, but those who knew him said he was different after that night. He stopped working night shifts, started checking his rearview mirror constantly, jumped at unexpected sounds. He was still a good cop, but something in him had changed. He kept having dreams about that night. In the dreams, he'd follow the blood trail further into the desert, and it wouldn't end. It would go on, and eventually he'd find Vernon Pike, standing in a circle of other people, all of them with fatal wounds, all of them listening to something only they could hear. And in the dreams, Vernon would turn to him and smile and say, "She's still talking. Can't you hear her?" The Pike house still stands empty in the desert. The tribe sealed it up, posted no trespassing signs, even performed a cleansing ceremony. But teenagers sometimes break in, drawn by the stories that have grown around the place. They say if you go there at night and listen carefully, you can still hear voices. Not from speakers this time, but from the walls themselves, from the earth beneath the foundation. Voices that tell you things you don't want to know, secrets that should stay buried. Most who break in leave quickly, scared by the darkness and the smell that still lingers despite the years. But some stay longer, and those who do sometimes report seeing things. A woman in a white nightgown, standing in the doorway of that terrible room. A man with a knife, walking through the walls as if they're not there. And sometimes they say the cassette player in that room starts playing on its own, even though it was removed years ago as evidence. Mildred Good retired the following year. In her exit interview, she mentioned the Pike call only once. She said that after Thaddeus's radio went dead that night, she could have sworn she heard something else on the frequency. A woman's voice, faint and distorted, repeating the same phrase over and over. "He's coming home, he's coming home, he's coming home." She said she'd tried to respond to ask who was speaking, but the voice never acknowledged her. It just kept repeating that phrase until Thaddeus's radio came back online. She never reported it officially. Who would believe her? The official report lists Vernon Pike as missing, presumed dead. His file sits in a cabinet in the tribal police headquarters, one of dozens of cold cases that will never be solved. But sometimes, officers working the night shift report strange things on their radios when they pass through that sector. Voices in the static, always just on the edge of hearing, always saying things that don't quite make sense. And sometimes, on cold November nights when the conditions are just right, officers patrolling that sector report seeing a tall figure walking along the highway. They slow down, thinking it's someone who needs help. Maybe a drunk who wandered away from his vehicle. But when they get close enough to see clearly, there's never anyone there. Just the desert and the darkness and the feeling that something is watching from just beyond the reach of their headlights. Thaddeus never talks about that night. Not to other officers, not to his family, not even to the department psychologist he was required to see. But he kept the cassette tape from evidence after the case was closed. The one with Vernon's voice. Sometimes, late at night in his new apartment in Flagstaff, he takes it out and looks at it. He's never played it again. He tells himself he never will. But sometimes, even without playing it, he swears he can hear Vernon's voice, talking about the things his sister told him, about the secrets in the desert, about the bodies that are buried but not at rest. And sometimes, just sometimes, he hears Margaret's voice too, still talking, still telling secrets, still refusing to be quiet even in death. The tape sits in a locked drawer in his desk now, wrapped in a cloth bag his grandmother gave him, one blessed by a medicine man. He's thought about destroying it 100 times, burning it, burying it, throwing it in a lake. But something stops him. Maybe it's evidence. Maybe it's a reminder. Or maybe it's because he knows that destroying the tape won't stop the voices. Nothing stops the voices once they start. They just move from one medium to another, from tape to radio to the static in your mind when you're trying to sleep. Thaddeus has looked into the history of the Pike family. Their father disappeared in 1982. Their mother died in 1991, officially of natural causes. But the funeral home director told Thaddeus off the record that it was the strangest natural death he'd ever seen. She looked scared, he said. Even dead, she looked scared. There were other siblings once. 2 brothers, both died young. One drowned in a wash during a flash flood. His body found miles from where he should have been. The other simply disappeared one day, walked into the desert and never came back. Just like Vernon. The land where the Pike house sits has a history, too. It was the site of something bad long before the Pikes built there. The elders won't talk about it directly, but Thaddeus has pieced together fragments. A massacre, maybe. Or something older, something from before the reservation, before the army, before written history. The kind of thing that leaves a mark on a place, that makes the earth itself remember. He's thought about going back, especially during the day when the sun is high and the shadows are short. He's thought about looking for Vernon, following that blood trail with proper equipment, ground-penetrating radar maybe, or thermal imaging, but he never does. Because he knows deep down that Vernon Pike is both gone and still there, existing in some space between life and death, between the physical world and whatever lies beyond. The new officer who took over Thaddeus's patrol sector is young, eager, dismissive of the stories. He says it's all superstition, that Vernon Pike probably just crawled off to die somewhere and the animals got him. He patrols past the Pike house without a second thought, laughs at the other officers who won't go there alone. But last month he called in sick 3 shifts in a row after responding to a false alarm at the Pike house. When he came back, he was different, quieter. He requested a sector change, which was granted. When asked why, he just said he'd heard something on his radio that shouldn't have been there. A woman's voice, telling him things about his own family, secrets he thought no one knew. The Pike house remains sealed. The tribe has discussed demolishing it, but there's a reluctance, a fear that destroying the house might release whatever it contains. So it sits, slowly decaying, slowly being reclaimed by the desert, but never quite disappearing. And Vernon Pike remains missing, his file growing thicker with reported sightings that lead nowhere, with strange incidents that might be connected or might just be the desert playing tricks. Officers know to be careful in that sector, to keep their radios on, to never go alone if they can help it. Because in the vast darkness of the reservation, where the nearest backup might be an hour away and radio signals fade into static, there are things that can't be explained by procedure or training. There are places where the boundary between life and death is thin, where voices carry across impossible distances, where a man can walk into the desert trailing blood and simply cease to exist. Thaddeus Kern still serves as an officer, though never again in that sector. He's a good cop, thorough, careful, respected by his peers. But he never works alone anymore, and he never, ever responds to domestic disturbance calls. When asked why, he just shakes his head and says some calls change you, some scenes never leave you. Late at night, when he can't sleep, he sometimes drives out to the edge of town and looks toward the desert, toward where the Pike House sits in its isolation. He wonders if Vernon is out there, still walking, still following the voice of his dead sister. He wonders if Margaret is still talking, still telling secrets to anyone who will listen. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is quiet, he swears he can hear them both, carried on the desert wind, a conversation between the living and the dead that will never end. Because some voices, once they start speaking, can never be silenced. They just keep talking, keep telling their secrets, keep calling people home to places they should never go. The call came in at 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon in late September. Officer Leland Gage was finishing his paperwork from a minor traffic accident when the dispatcher's voice crackled through the station radio with an urgency that made everyone stop what they were doing. All units, we have a missing child report in the Sagi Canyon area. 8-year-old male, last seen approximately 2 hours ago near the family residence. Parents are Horace and Edith Vance. Child's name is Timothy Vance. Brown hair, brown eyes, wearing a red jacket and jeans. Unit requested for immediate response. Leland grabbed his jacket before the dispatcher finished speaking. Missing children in the canyon areas were serious. The terrain was treacherous, full of drops and crevices where a small body could disappear. And with sunset only a few hours away, time was critical. The temperature would drop 20 degrees once the sun went behind the canyon walls. Unit 4 responding, Leland said into his shoulder radio as he headed for his cruiser. ETA 25 minutes. The drive out to Sagi Canyon took him through some of the most beautiful and dangerous terrain on the reservation. The red rock walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, creating natural corridors that had been used for thousands of years. Ancient petroglyphs dotted the canyon walls, watching modern travelers the same way they'd watch the Anasazi. But beauty aside, this was no place for a child to wander alone. The Vance residence was a modest double-wide trailer situated on a flat area about half a mile from the main canyon. A small yard was fenced with chicken wire, and a few scraggly trees provided minimal shade. As Leland pulled up, he noticed things that immediately seemed off. The gate was open, swinging slightly in the wind. There were no toys in the yard, no bicycle, nothing to indicate a child lived here. Horace Vance met him at the door before he could knock. The man was probably 45, thin to the point of gauntness, with deep-set eyes that didn't quite meet Leland's gaze. His hands were clean, Leland noticed. Too clean for someone who'd supposedly been searching for his missing son for 2 hours. "Officer, thank God you're here," Horace said, but his voice lacked the panic Leland expected from a parent with a missing child. "Timothy wandered off while I was working on the truck. You know how boys are, always exploring." "When exactly did you notice he was missing, Mr. Vance?" Leland pulled out his notepad, watching the man's face carefully. "About 2 hours ago, like I told dispatch. Maybe 2:30. Horace's eyes darted toward the trailer, then back. "My wife's inside. She's very upset. I'll need to speak with her. But first, where have you already searched?" Horace gestured vaguely toward the canyon. "All around here." Called his name, checked his usual playing spots. He paused, swallowed hard. "He likes to climb the rocks near the wash. I told him 100 times not to go there alone." Leland nodded, making notes. "Does Timothy have any medical conditions I should know about? Medications he needs?" "No, nothing like that. He's a healthy boy, strong for his age." Again, that glance toward the trailer. I need to speak with your wife now, and I'll need a recent photo of Timothy." Horace hesitated just a fraction too long. "Of course, come in." The inside of the trailer was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. The air was stale, carrying an odd sweetness like overripe fruit. Edith Vance sat on a worn couch, her hands folded in her lap. She was younger than her husband, maybe 35, with long dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. When she looked up at Leland, her eyes were dry, no signs of recent crying. "Mrs. Vance, I'm Officer Gage. Can you tell me what Timothy was wearing when you last saw him?" Edith glanced at her husband before answering. A red jacket, his favorite, jeans and sneakers. Her voice was flat, rehearsed. "When did you last see him?" "This morning, at breakfast." She paused, seeming to consider her words. "He had cereal, then he went outside to play." Leland noticed there were no cereal bowls in the sink, no milk in the refrigerator when Horace opened it to offer him water. The kitchen was spotless, untouched. "Do you have that recent photo?" Leland asked. Horace produced a school photo, clearly from last year based on the date stamp. The boy in the picture had a forced smile, dark circles under his eyes. He looked thin, smaller than most 8-year-olds. "I'm going to call for additional units to help with the search," Leland said. "I'll need you both to stay here in case Timothy comes back on his own." Outside, Leland called for backup and began his own search pattern. He started with the wash Horace had mentioned, looking for footprints in the sandy bottom. Nothing fresh. No small sneaker tracks, no disturbances in the sand that had been smoothed by last week's rain. He expanded his search in circles around the property. About 100 yards from the trailer, hidden behind a cluster of juniper bushes, he found something that made his blood run cold. A red jacket, partially buried under loose dirt and leaves. It was small, child-sized, with what looked like dark stains on the sleeve. Leland photographed the jacket's location before carefully extracting it. The stains were definitely blood, dried but not old. Maybe a day or two. He bagged it as evidence and continued searching, now with a much grimmer purpose. Behind a large boulder, he found more disturbed earth. It looked like something had been buried recently, then dug up again. Animal predation, maybe, or something else. He marked the location and moved on, his hand now resting on his service weapon. The sun was starting to set when he circled back toward the trailer. Through the window, he could see Horace and Edith sitting at the kitchen table, talking in low voices. Their body language was all wrong for parents of a missing child. They looked relieved, not worried. Leland called dispatch on a secure channel. "I need crime scene techs out here, possible evidence found. And I need someone to run a welfare check on Timothy Vance. Check school records, medical records, anything from the last month." While waiting for backup, Leland decided to press the parents harder. He knocked on the trailer door, and this time it was Edith who answered. "Mrs. Vance, I found a red jacket about 100 yards from here. Can you confirm if it's Timothy's?" Her face went pale. "You found his jacket? Did you find him?" "Just the jacket so far, but there appears to be blood on it. Can you explain that?" Edith's hand went to her mouth. The gesture seemed genuine, but her eyes remained calculating. "He fell yesterday, scraped his arm on the rocks. I told him to be careful. I'll need to see where he fell. I don't remember exactly. These rocks all look the same." Horace appeared behind his wife. "What's going on?" "I found Timothy's jacket. Your wife says he fell yesterday and scraped his arm." "That's right," Horace said quickly, too quickly. "Kids always getting banged up, you know how boys are." "You said that before. You know how boys are. But I don't see any toys here. No bike, no boys' clothes on the washing line. When was the last time anyone else saw Timothy?" The parents exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "He's homeschooled. Edith said. "We keep to ourselves." "I'm going to need to search the residence," Leland said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "You need a warrant for that," Horace said, stepping forward slightly. "Not if I have probable cause that a child is in immediate danger. And right now, Mr. Vance, I have a missing child in a bloody jacket. That's probable cause enough." The search of the trailer revealed more troubling details. Timothy's room was too neat, too organized. The bed was made with military precision. No toys on the floor, no posters on the walls. It looked like a display room, not where a real child lived. The closet had clothes, all clean, all folded, all looking barely worn. In the parents' room, Leland found prescription bottles. Lots of them. Antipsychotics, sedatives, pain medications. Some in Edith's name, some in Horace's, and disturbingly, some in Timothy's. "Why does an 8-year-old need Risperdal?" Leland asked, holding up the bottle. "He has behavioral issues," Edith said quietly. "The doctor prescribed them." "Which doctor?" She couldn't answer. She looked at Horace, who shook his head slightly. The backup units arrived just as Leland found the most damning evidence. In a locked shed behind the trailer, he discovered a hole, recently dug, about 4 feet deep and 6 feet long, child-sized. Next to it was a bag of lime and a shovel with fresh dirt on it. "Where is Timothy?" Leland asked, his hand now on his weapon. "Where is your son?" Edith broke first. She collapsed into a chair, sobbing, but even her tears seemed calculated, performed. "It was an accident," she whispered. "He wouldn't take his medicine. He kept fighting us. Horace just wanted him to be quiet just for a while." "Where is he?" Leland repeated. Horace's face had gone stone cold. "You don't understand. He wasn't our son. Not really. We found him years ago, abandoned. We took him in, gave him a home." "That doesn't answer my question." "He's in the canyon," Edith said suddenly. "In a cave about a mile north. We put him there after it happened." Leland called for all available units and a search and rescue team. He cuffed both parents, read them their rights, and had another officer transport them to the station. Then he joined the search for the cave. They found it just as the last light was fading from the sky. It was small, barely more than a crevice in the rock face, hidden behind a fall of boulders. Inside, wrapped in a tarp, was a small body. But when they carefully unwrapped it, Leland got another shock. The body was mummified, dried out completely. It had been dead for weeks, maybe months, not the 2 hours the parents had claimed. The medical examiner later determined that Timothy Vance had been dead for at least 6 weeks. He'd died of blunt force trauma to the head, along with signs of long-term malnutrition and abuse. The parents had been collecting his disability checks, maintaining the fiction that he was alive and homeschooled. The prescription medications told another story. They'd been drugging him heavily, keeping him sedated and compliant. The behavioral issues were likely just a normal child's reaction to being imprisoned and abused. During interrogation, the truth came out in pieces. Horace and Edith weren't Timothy's biological parents. They'd taken him from a shopping center in Flagstaff 5 years ago, when he was 3. They'd moved frequently, staying off the grid, homeschooling to avoid questions. Timothy had started to resist more as he got older, started to remember things from before. He'd tried to run away multiple times, which is why they'd moved to such an isolated location. The final incident had been 6 weeks ago. He'd managed to get out of the trailer and had run toward the main road. Horace had caught him near the canyon edge. In the struggle, Timothy had fallen or been pushed. The head injury had been fatal. Instead of reporting it, they'd hidden the body and continued the charade, planning to eventually stage a disappearance. Make it look like he'd wandered into the canyon and gotten lost. They'd been preparing the story for weeks. which is why their performance had seemed so rehearsed. The real Timothy Vance, Leland learned, was actually named Michael Bittner. His real parents had been searching for him for 5 years. They'd never given up hope, had appeared on news shows, had plastered his photo everywhere. But Horace and Edith had changed his appearance, dyed his hair, kept him hidden. The jacket with blood had been planted deliberately. They'd cut themselves to provide the blood, then partially buried it where they knew it would be found. They wanted it to look like an accident, like Timothy had fallen and wandered off injured. The grave in the shed was meant for later, after the search was called off and they could claim to have found his body themselves. But they hadn't counted on Leland's instincts, on his attention to the wrong details. The too clean house, the lack of toys, the dry eyes, the rehearsed answers, all the little things that added up to something monstrous. Edith Crane broke completely during the trial. She claimed to hear Timothy's voice constantly begging her to let him go home. She was eventually declared incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric facility. She spends her days talking to a son who isn't there, apologizing to empty air. Horace Vance was convicted of kidnapping and murder. He got life without parole. He maintains that he loved Timothy, that he gave him a better life than his real parents could have. He shows no remorse, no understanding of what he's done. Leland testified at the trial, his detailed notes and observations crucial to the conviction. But the case haunted him. The image of that small, mummified body in the cave, wrapped like garbage and left to the elements, stayed with him. He thinks about the real parents, the Bittners, who finally got closure but not their son. He'd had to tell them, had to watch their hope die and be replaced by grief. The mother had collapsed, the father had stood frozen, unable to comprehend that their 5-year search was over in the worst possible way. The reservation has many missing children cases. Some are runaways, some are custody disputes, some are accidents, but some are like Timothy Vance, children who vanish into the vast emptiness and are never seen again. Leland has worked dozens of these cases since then, and he approaches each one with the same thoroughness, the same attention to detail, because he knows now that the monsters aren't always strangers in the dark. Sometimes they're the people who claim to love you, who give you a bed and food and medicine, who say they're protecting you while they're slowly killing you. The trailer where the Vances lived has been removed, the lot cleared. But officers who patrol that area report strange things. The sound of a child laughing in the canyon when no one's there. Small footprints that appear in the sand after rain, leading toward the road, always toward the road, as if someone's still trying to run away. Leland doesn't patrol that sector anymore. He requested a transfer to investigations, where he specializes in missing children cases. He's good at it, they say. He has an instinct for when parents are lying, for when something's not right. He saved 17 children so far, found them before it was too late. But he still dreams about Timothy sometimes. In the dreams, the boy is alive in that cave, calling for help, and Leland is searching but can't find the entrance. He wakes up with dirt under his fingernails from clawing at dream rocks, his throat raw from calling out to a child who's been dead for months. He keeps Michael Bittner's real school photo on his desk, the one his birth parents provided. A smiling 3-year-old with bright eyes and chubby cheeks, before Horace and Edith Vance stole him and turned him into Timothy. It reminds him why he does this work, why he pays attention to the small, wrong details that others might miss. The Vances' other secrets came out slowly during the investigation. There had been another child before Timothy, a girl they called Sarah. She'd run away 2 years before Timothy died. Her body was never found, but cadaver dogs alerted on several spots around the property. The ground was too rocky, too disturbed by weather to excavate properly. Neighbors from their previous residences, when tracked down, remembered children who were there and then weren't. Always homeschooled, always thin, always quiet. The Vances would move suddenly, usually after someone started asking questions. A pattern going back at least a decade. How many children had there been? How many Timothy Vances were buried in unmarked graves across the Southwest? The FBI got involved, following the trail of the Vances' movements. They found evidence of at least 4 more children who had lived with the couple at various times. None were ever found. Edith, in her psychiatric facility, sometimes talks about them. She gives names: Sarah, Marcus, Jenny, David. She talks to them like they're in the room with her. She sets places for them at her table in the craft room. The staff have stopped trying to convince her they're not there. It's easier to let her live in her delusion. Horace, in his prison cell, reads the Bible and writes letters to churches proclaiming his innocence. He says he was saving those children from worse fates. He says God told him to take them, to give them proper homes. He says Timothy's death was God's will, that the boy was too corrupted by the outside world to be saved. The guards report that sometimes, late at night, they hear him talking to someone in his cell, having full conversations with responses to questions no one else can hear. They've checked the cameras. He's always alone. But he talks and talks, pausing as if listening to answers, nodding as if in agreement. One guard swears he heard a child's voice coming from the cell once, just for a moment, saying, "I want to go home." But when he looked, it was just Horace, alone as always, smiling at the empty air. The canyon where Timothy's body was found has become a place locals avoid. They say the rocks remember trauma, hold on to it like they hold on to heat from the sun. They say if you go there at dawn or dusk, when the light plays tricks, you can see small shadows moving among the rocks, always heading towards the road, never quite reaching it. Leland Oz knows these are just stories, ways for people to process horror, to make sense of the senseless. But he also knows that some truths are too terrible for facts alone. Sometimes you need ghosts and shadows and whispered stories to carry the weight of what humans can do to each other. He still has nightmares about finding other caves, other wrapped bundles. In the dreams, the children are always almost alive, always just a few minutes too late to save. He wakes up gasping, reaching for a pulse that isn't there, trying to revive bodies that have been dead for weeks. The Bittners buried their son under his real name. The headstone reads, "Michael Bittner, beloved son, finally home." They visit every week, bringing toys he never got to play with, books he never got to read. They talk to him like he's there, tell him about his little sister who was born after he disappeared, who looks just like him. Sometimes they see a small boy near the grave, always at a distance, always walking away. They want to believe it's Michael, finally free, finally able to leave. But they know it's just grief playing tricks, just their minds trying to rewrite an ending that can't be changed. The case file on Timothy Vance Michael Bittner is thick now, full of reports and testimonies and evidence photos. It's taught at the police academy as an example of why you should trust your instincts, why the small details matter, why you should never take parents at their word when a child is missing. Young officers study it and think they understand. But Leland knows you can't understand until you've stood in that cave, seen that small bundle, smelled death mixed with desert air. You can't understand until you've looked parents in the eye and realized they're mourning a fiction while their child's body decomposes in the dark. The reservation has too many missing children. Most are found, scared but safe. Some are found too late, and some are never found at all, becoming stories, becoming warnings, becoming ghosts that walk the canyon paths forever searching for home. Leland continues his work, methodical and thorough. He checks the details others miss. He pushes when others would accept easy answers. He saved many children because of what Timothy taught him. That love can be a performance. That homes can be prisons. That sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones you need protection from. Late at night, when he's working a new case, he sometimes feels like he's not alone in his office. Like there's a small presence watching him work, urging him to look closer, to ask one more question, to not give up. He doesn't believe in ghosts, but he believes in duty to the dead, in justice for those who can no longer speak. The desert holds many secrets. Bodies buried in unmarked graves, children who disappeared and were never missed because officially they didn't exist. The Vances were caught, but how many others are out there? How many children are trapped in trailers and remote houses, drugged and controlled, their real names forgotten? These are the thoughts that keep Leland working, that make him check and double-check every missing child report. Because somewhere out there right now there might be another Timothy, another Michael, waiting to be found, hoping someone will notice the small wrong details that reveal the truth. The work is hard, heartbreaking more often than not. But occasionally he finds them in time. Occasionally he breaks down a door or sees through a lie and saves a child from becoming another ghost in the canyon. Those saves don't erase Timothy's death, don't undo what the Vances did, but they balance the scales a little. And sometimes that's all you can ask for in this work. Not to save them all, because you can't, but to save the ones you can, to speak for the ones who can't speak anymore, to remember the ones everyone else forgets. Timothy Vance never existed, not really. But Michael Bittner did, a 3-year-old boy who loved trucks and dinosaurs, who was taken from a shopping center while his mother was distracted for just a moment. A boy who spent 5 years as someone else, drugged and controlled, and ultimately killed by people who claimed to love him. His story is a reminder that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like concern, like love, like parents searching desperately for their missing child. Sometimes the real monsters are the ones who call the police, who cry on cue, who've practiced their lines until they almost believe them themselves. The canyon is quiet now. The cave has been sealed. The trailer lot stands empty. But the story persists, passed between officers like a warning, a reminder to look closer, to trust their instincts, to remember that in the vast isolation of the reservation, terrible things can happen in plain sight. And somewhere in a psychiatric facility, Edith Crane still sets a place at her table for Timothy. She saves him cookies, tells him stories, apologizes endlessly for things that can never be forgiven. The staff say she seems happy in her delusion, living in a world where the children she helped kill are still alive, still with her, still needing her care. It's a mercy, perhaps, that madness has given her what reality couldn't. A version of events where she's not a monster, where the children are safe, where her love is real and not a performance that ended in death. But for Leland Gage, there's no such mercy. He lives with the truth, carries it with him into every new case, uses it to fuel his determination to find the missing before they become the lost. He knows that somewhere out there, another child needs him to pay attention, to notice what others miss, to be the one who doesn't stop looking. The desert is vast, full of hidden places where terrible things can happen, but it's also full of officers like Leland who've learned from the worst cases, who know that sometimes the danger isn't from the stranger but from the ones who claim to be family. Officer Wendell Page had been patrolling the eastern sector of the Navajo Nation for 12 years, and in all that time, he'd developed a sixth sense for when something was wrong. It wasn't anything mystical or supernatural, just the accumulated experience of thousands of hours driving these lonely roads, observing patterns, noticing what didn't belong. That's why the blue sedan caught his attention immediately on that cold February morning. The car was parked on the shoulder of Highway 191, about 30 miles south of Chinle. Not broken down, not pulled over haphazardly, but deliberately parked, perfectly parallel to the road. The morning sun reflected off its windshield, creating a glare that made it impossible to see inside. Wendell slowed his cruiser as he approached, noting the Nevada plates. Tourist, probably, though this was an odd place for sightseeing. He pulled up behind the vehicle and ran the plates while still in his cruiser. The car was registered to Orson Bates, 52 years old, from Henderson, Nevada. No warrants, no flags, just an ordinary citizen with an ordinary car in an extraordinary location. Wendell grabbed his jacket against the biting wind and stepped out to investigate. The sedan was unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine cold. On the passenger seat was a wallet, open to show a driver's license. Orson Bates stared up from the photo, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and tired eyes. Next to the wallet was a cell phone, fully charged but with no signal out here. The back seat held a small suitcase and a laptop bag, both undisturbed. Wendell walked around the vehicle, looking for signs of struggle or distress. The tires were intact, no visible damage to the body, but in the dirt beside the driver's door, he found footprints. One set, leading away from the car into the desert. They were deep, deliberate, heading east toward the mesa that rose about a mile from the road. He followed the tracks for about 50 yards before returning to his cruiser to call it in. The dispatcher took down the information and promised to contact the Nevada authorities to see if anyone had reported Orson Bates missing. While waiting for a response, Wendell decided to follow the footprints further. The trail was easy to follow at first. Orson had walked in a straight line, apparently with purpose. But about a quarter mile from the road, the tracks became erratic. They circled back on themselves, crossed and recrossed as if Orson had become confused or lost. Then, abruptly, they stopped, not at a rock or obstacle, but in the middle of soft sand. Simply ended, as if Orson had ceased to exist mid-step. Wendell stood at the spot where the tracks ended, turning in a slow circle. The mesa loomed to the east, its red face catching the morning light. To the north and south, empty desert stretched to the horizon. To the west, his cruiser was a small dot beside the abandoned sedan. There was nowhere Orson could have gone without leaving tracks, yet the tracks simply stopped. He returned to his vehicle to find a message from dispatch. No missing person report had been filed for Orson Bates. His employer, an accounting firm in Henderson, said he'd taken a week's vacation but wasn't due back for 3 more days. His apartment manager hadn't seen him, but said that wasn't unusual. As far as anyone knew, Orson Bates had simply decided to take a drive through the desert. Wendell called for a tow truck to impound the vehicle and began a more thorough investigation. In the glove compartment, he found rental paperwork. Orson had rented the car from the airport in Albuquerque 3 days ago. The mileage suggested he'd driven straight here with no significant detours. Under the driver's seat, Wendell found something odd. A small notebook filled with what looked like coordinates and dates. The dates went back years, and the coordinates, when he checked them on his GPS, were all for locations within the Navajo Nation. Remote locations, far from any towns or landmarks. The last entry was for this exact spot, dated yesterday. As he was examining the notebook, a pickup truck pulled over. An elderly woman got out, moving slowly but purposefully toward him. Wendell recognized her as Loretta Hale, a local who lived about 10 miles up the road. She'd been living out here alone since her husband died 5 years ago, surviving on Social Security and selling jewelry to tourists. "Officer Page," she said. Her voice cracked from age and desert air. "I saw this car here yesterday evening, saw the man too. You saw him? When exactly? Loretta squinted at the sedan, then at the desert beyond. Must have been around 6, just as the sun was going down. He was standing by his car, looking east, just standing there still as a statue. I slowed down to see if he needed help, but when I looked at his face... She trailed off, shaking her head. What about his face? He was crying, she said simply. Tears running down his cheeks, but his expression was blank, like the tears were happening without him knowing. It spooked me, so I kept driving, but I watched in my mirror, and he started walking, straight into the desert, like he knew exactly where he was going. Did you see where he went? Loretta pointed toward the mesa, that direction. But officer, there's nothing out there. Nothing but old ruins and bad memories. What do you mean, bad memories? The old woman looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight. You know the stories. Everyone who's lived here long enough knows them. People who walk into the desert and don't come back. People who come back but aren't the same. That spot, right there where that car is parked, that's where they found the Begay family's truck back in '93. Wendell knew the case, though it had happened before his time. A family of 4 had vanished, their vehicle found exactly here. They were never located, despite extensive searches. Since then, there had been 3 other incidents at this same spot, all vehicles abandoned, all drivers vanishing into the desert. Mrs. Hale, I need you to think carefully. Was Orson alone when you saw him? She considered this, her weathered face creasing in concentration. I thought so at the time, but now that you mention it, he kept looking to his left like someone was walking beside him, nodding like he was having a conversation, but there was nobody there, nobody I could see anyway. Wendell thanked her and took her contact information. After she left, he stood by the abandoned sedan, weighing his options. Protocol said to wait for backup before pursuing into the desert. But the temperature was dropping, and if Orson was out there, injured or confused, he might not survive another night. He gathered supplies from his cruiser: water, first aid kit, emergency blanket, flares. He radioed his position to dispatch and set off following the tracks again. This time, he continued past where they ended, heading in the direction they'd been going. The ground became rockier, making tracking impossible, but he pressed on toward the mesa. About a mile from the road, he found the first strange thing: a pile of clothes, neatly folded, sitting on a flat rock. Men's clothes, the sizes matching what Orson would wear. They were arranged precisely: shirt on bottom, then pants, then underwear and socks on top. The shoes were placed beside the pile, laces still tied. Wendell photographed everything before continuing. The mesa was closer now, and he could see what looked like a path winding up its face. As he approached, he found more items. Orson's watch, expensive looking, placed carefully on a rock. Then his wedding ring, though the information from Nevada indicated he was divorced. Then a pair of glasses, prescription by the look of them. The trail led to a narrow canyon that cut into the mesa. The walls rose 50 feet on either side, the passage barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. Wendell pulled out his flashlight, though the sun was still high enough to provide some light. The temperature dropped noticeably as he entered the canyon, and the silence was absolute. Even the wind didn't reach here. 20 yards in, he found Orson's wallet, placed in a small niche in the rock wall. Another 20 yards, the cell phone, positioned carefully on a ledge. It was as if Orson had been leaving a trail, or divesting himself of his identity piece by piece. The canyon opened into a wider space, almost circular, about 30 feet across. The walls were covered in petroglyphs, ancient symbols carved by hands dead for centuries. In the center of the space was Orson Bates. He was alive, sitting cross-legged on the ground, completely naked despite the cold. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something beyond the physical world. His lips moved constantly, whispering words Wendell couldn't understand. His skin was pale, almost blue from the cold, but he showed no signs of discomfort. "Mr. Bates," Wendell said, softly, not wanting to startle him. "I'm Officer Page with the Navajo Nation Police. Are you injured?" Orson didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge Wendell's presence. He continued his whispered monologue, his body swaying slightly. Wendell approached carefully, noting that Orson had drawn symbols in the dirt around himself, copying some of the petroglyphs from the walls. "Mr. Bates, we need to get you medical attention. Can you hear me?" This time, Orson's eyes shifted, focusing on Wendell with an intensity that was unsettling. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse but clear. "They showed me. They finally showed me where it happened." "Where what happened? Who showed you?" "My daughter," Orson said, and tears began flowing down his cheeks, though his expression remained blank, just as Loretta had described. "She's been calling me here for 15 years, ever since she disappeared." Wendell's hand moved instinctively to his radio. He knew he should call for backup, for medical, but something made him hesitate. "Your daughter disappeared?" "Rebecca. She was 19, driving back to college through here. Her car was found right where I parked, right at that exact spot. They never found her. Said she wandered into the desert, got lost. But she didn't get lost. She was taken." "Taken by who?" Orson's gaze drifted back to the unfocused stare. "By the ones who take people at that spot? The ones who've always taken people there. They showed me where they keep them, where they keep all of them." Wendell looked around the circular chamber. There were no other passages, no hidden doors, nowhere people could be kept. But Orson was pointing at the wall, at a section covered in petroglyphs. "There's nothing there, Mr. Bates. It's solid rock." "Not always," Orson whispered. "Not when the light is right, not when they want to show you. She's in there, with the others. I can hear them all. They want out, but they can't leave. They're part of the rock now, part of the story the Ancient Ones carved." Wendell pulled out the emergency blanket and wrapped it around Orson's shoulders. The man didn't resist, but didn't help either. He was like a doll, posable but not participant. As Wendell tried to get him to stand, Orson grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't you hear them?" he asked urgently. "They're so loud. How can you not hear them?" And for just a moment, Wendell thought he did hear something. A whisper, multiple whispers, coming from the walls themselves. Voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, some ancient, some modern. Men, women, children, all talking at once. All saying the same thing in different tongues. But when he concentrated, the sound faded, leaving only the wind finally reaching into the canyon. He got Orson to his feet and began walking him out. Orson came willingly but kept looking back, reaching toward the walls as if trying to touch someone only he could see. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," he kept saying. "I'm sorry I couldn't find you sooner." At the canyon mouth, Orson suddenly pulled away and pressed his hands against the rock wall. "She's right here," he said, "right beneath the surface. If I could just break through." He began clawing at the rock with his fingernails, breaking them, leaving bloody smears on the stone. Wendell had to physically restrain him, half carrying him back toward the road. Orson fought him part of the way, then suddenly went limp, all the fight draining out of him. "She says it's okay," he mumbled. "She says she understands. She says I can come back when I'm ready. When I'm ready to stay." They made slow progress back to the road. Wendell had radioed for an ambulance and it arrived just as they reached the vehicles. The paramedics took over, checking Orson's vitals, treating his scraped fingers and hypothermia. He was responsive to their questions but kept insisting he needed to go back, that his daughter was waiting. As they loaded him into the ambulance, he grabbed Wendell's hand one more time. "The notebook," he said urgently. "The coordinates. Those are all the places where people have gone missing and cars were found. I've been tracking them for years. They're all connected. All of them lead back here, to this spot. This is where they cross over." The ambulance left, and Wendell was alone with the abandoned sedan and his thoughts. He retrieved the notebook and studied it more carefully. Orson was right. Every coordinate corresponded to an unsolved missing person case, some going back decades. All vehicles found, no bodies recovered. He walked back to where Orson's footprints ended and stood there as the sun began to set. The light changed the landscape, throwing long shadows, making the familiar alien. And for just a moment, he thought he saw them. Figures walking in the desert, translucent, following paths that didn't exist. Men, women, children, all walking toward the mesa, all walking with purpose. Then he blinked, and they were gone. Just tricks of the light and shadow. Just his tired mind processing a strange day. But as he walked back to his cruiser, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something in the desert had taken notice of him. The sedan was towed that evening. Wendell filed his report, leaving out the strangest details. He listed it as a mental health crisis, a man overwhelmed by grief seeking closure for his daughter's disappearance. The official record wouldn't mention the whispers from the walls, or the figures in the desert, or the way Orson's footprints simply ended. But Wendell kept the notebook. He added his own notes, his own observations, because he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this wouldn't be the last abandoned vehicle at this spot. There would be others. There always had been, according to Orson's research, going back as far as records existed. 3 days later, he got a call from the psychiatric ward where Orson was being held. The man had escaped, simply walked out despite being in a secure unit. Security footage showed him leaving, but also showed him apparently talking to someone beside him, someone the cameras couldn't see. He was found that evening at the same spot on Highway 191, sitting in the dirt where his rental car had been, completely catatonic. They brought him back, increased security, but he escaped again a week later. This time, they didn't find him. Search teams combed the desert. Helicopters flew grid patterns, but Orson Bates had vanished as completely as his daughter had 15 years before. Wendell went back to the canyon in the mesa. He found Orson's hospital clothes, neatly folded on the same rock where he'd left his other clothes. But Orson himself was gone. The only new thing was a message, scratched into the rock wall with something sharp. Maybe a fingernail. She was waiting. The incidents continued. Every few months, another abandoned vehicle at that same spot. Always with the keys in the ignition, always with the driver's belongings left behind. Wendell responded to each one. Followed the footprints that always ended in the same general area. Searched the canyon that never held anyone alive. He started keeping files on all of them, continuing Orson's work. He found patterns. Many of the missing had lost someone themselves, someone who had vanished in the desert years or decades before. They came looking for answers and became part of the question. They came seeking the lost and became lost themselves. Loretta Hale called him one evening, about a year after Orson's disappearance. She'd seen something, she said, and thought he should know. She'd been driving past that spot at dusk and had seen people standing by the road. Dozens of them, all ages, all facing the mesa. They were translucent, she said, like old photographs held up to the light. "I recognize some of them," she told Wendell, her voice shaking. "The Begay family, that tourist couple from '97, and Officer, I saw that man, Orson Bates. He was standing with a young woman who looked just like him. They were holding hands." Wendell thanked her for the information, but didn't add it to his official files. Some things couldn't be explained in reports, couldn't be reduced to procedure and protocol. But he knew what he'd seen, what Loretta had seen, what others would see. The spot on Highway 191 is still there. The state has discussed putting up barriers, warning signs, something to stop people from pulling over. But they never do. It's just an ordinary stretch of road, they say, no more dangerous than any other. The disappearances are coincidences, statistical anomalies. But Wendell knows better. He's seen the patterns, felt the pull of that place. He's heard the whispers from the canyon walls and seen the figures walking in the desert. He knows that some places are thin, where the boundary between here and somewhere else is permeable. And he knows that sometimes people cross over, drawn by voices only they can hear, following loved ones who crossed before them. He still patrols that sector, still responds to abandoned vehicles. He saved a few, people he's found before they walked too far, before they heard too much. But many more have vanished, adding their voices to whatever chorus calls from the mesa. Late at night, when he's filling out paperwork and the station is quiet, he sometimes opens Orson's notebook. He's added 3 more years of incidents to it, 3 more years of patterns and connections. He wonders sometimes if he's becoming like Orson, obsessed with a mystery that has no solution, drawn to a puzzle that consumes those who try to solve it. But he also thinks about Rebecca Bates, 19 years old, driving through the desert alone. He thinks about her car found at that spot, her belongings abandoned, her footprints ending in empty sand. He thinks about her father, searching for 15 years, finally finding something, even if it wasn't what anyone else could understand. And sometimes, when he's at that spot on Highway 191, when the light is just right and the desert is silent, he thinks he hears her too, a young woman's voice calling from the mesa, saying she's okay, she's not alone, there are others here, saying that the crossing isn't death but transformation, isn't ending but continuation. He always walks away. He has to. He has a job to do, reports to file, a life in the world of the living. But he knows that one day, maybe, he'll hear a voice he recognizes. Someone he's lost, someone he's searched for. And on that day, he might park his cruiser on the shoulder, place his keys in the ignition, and walk into the desert, following footprints only he can see. The files grow thicker, the list of coordinates longer, the pattern clearer to those who look for it. And at that spot on Highway 191, vehicles continue to appear. Abandoned, but perfectly parked. Their drivers walking into the desert with purpose, following voices that promise reunion, answers, an end to searching. Wendell Page continues his patrol, continues his documentation. He's become the unofficial expert on the disappearances, the one other officers call when they find an abandoned vehicle. He tells them what to look for: the careful parking, the belongings left behind, the footprints that end abruptly. He tells them to be careful, to not listen too closely to the desert's whispers. But late at night, alone in his cruiser, he sometimes parks at that spot and sits in the darkness, listening. The voices are clearer now, more distinct. He can almost understand what they're saying, almost see the path they're describing. And he knows that his resistance is weakening, that the mystery is pulling him in, that one day he might become part of the story he's been documenting. The desert keeps its secrets, but it also shares them with those who stay long enough, who listen closely enough. And Officer Wendell Page has been listening for a long time now. The question isn't if he'll eventually follow those footprints into the mesa, but when, and whether anyone will be there to document his disappearance, to add his name to the growing list of those who sought answers and found something else entirely. For now, he drives on, watching for abandoned vehicles, following footprints that lead nowhere, gathering stories that no one quite believes. But he knows the truth. There are places where people cross over, drawn by loss and love and the promise of reunion. And that spot on Highway 191 is one of them, a door that's always open, a crossing that's always active. The call came in at 4:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in early March. Officer Marshall Boone had just poured his third cup of coffee at the station when dispatch forwarded a report from a rancher named Emmett Tate out near Shiprock. Livestock mutilation, the dispatcher said, though her voice carried an undertone that suggested this wasn't the usual case of coyotes or mountain lions. Marshall had been with the Navajo Nation police for 8 years, and he'd seen his share of dead livestock. The reservation's vast grazing lands meant constant conflicts between ranchers and predators. But when he arrived at the Tate Ranch just after sunrise, he immediately understood why this was different. The ranch sat in a valley between two mesas, about 40 miles from the nearest paved road. It was a modest operation, maybe 200 head of sheep, a dozen cattle, some horses. Emmett Tate met him at the gate, a weathered man in his 60s with hands that showed a lifetime of hard work. His face was pale despite his permanent tan, and his eyes kept darting toward the pasture behind his house. "Officer Boone," Emmett said, his voice steady but strained. "I've been ranching for 40 years. I've seen wolves, bears, big cats. I've seen what they do to livestock. This isn't that. This is something else." He led Marshall through the gate and across the dusty yard. The smell hit them before they reached the pasture, a mixture of blood and something else, something chemical and wrong. When they crested the small rise that led to the main grazing area, Marshall stopped in his tracks. 7 sheep lay in a perfect circle, each one precisely positioned with its head pointing toward the center. The morning sun cast long shadows from their bodies, creating a pattern that looked almost deliberate. As Marshall approached, the full extent of the mutilation became clear. Each animal had been cut with surgical precision. Specific organs had been removed: eyes, tongues, reproductive organs. The incisions were clean, cauterized somehow, with no blood pooling around the bodies. It was as if the blood had been drained completely before the cuts were made. There were no tracks around the bodies except for Emmett's boots from when he discovered them that morning. "When did this happen?" Marshall asked, pulling out his camera to document the scene. "Sometime between midnight and 4. I checked on them at midnight because I've been having trouble with coyotes. Everything was fine then. Found them like this when I came out to feed them this morning." Marshall walked the perimeter of the circle, noting the precise spacing between each animal. They were exactly equidistant from each other, something that would be difficult to achieve even with measuring tools. The grass around them was undisturbed except for one detail that made his skin crawl. Each animal had a small symbol burned into its hide, the same symbol repeated 7 times. It looked ancient, possibly Native American, but not from any tradition Marshall recognized. "Have you had any problems with trespassers?" Marshall asked. "Any threats, disputes with neighbors?" Emmett shook his head. "The nearest neighbor is Estelle Dyer, about 5 miles that way." He pointed east. "She's in her 70s, lives alone. We help each other out sometimes, but that's it. No disputes, no problems." Marshall continued his investigation, taking photographs and measurements. The lack of blood was disturbing. Even with the cleanest cuts, there should have been some blood, but the ground was dry. He found no tire tracks, no footprints except Emmett's, no sign that anyone had been here. "Mr. Tate, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Have you seen anything unusual lately? Lights in the sky, strangers on your property, Anything out of the ordinary?" Emmett hesitated, then nodded slowly. "3 nights ago, my dogs started going crazy around 2 in the morning. All of them barking and howling like I've never heard. I went out with my rifle, but I couldn't see anything. Then they just stopped, all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. And the next morning, I found one of them, Rex, my oldest shepherd, sitting in the middle of the pasture just staring at the sky. Wouldn't come when I called, wouldn't move. Had to physically carry him back to the house. Is the dog okay now? He won't go near that pasture anymore. None of them will. They start whimpering if I try to take them there." Marshall made notes of everything, then called for additional units and a veterinarian from the Tribal Agricultural Department. While waiting, he decided to visit Estelle Dyer to see if she'd witnessed anything unusual. The drive to the Dyer property took him along a rough dirt road that probably hadn't been graded in years. The house was small but well maintained, with a garden that seemed to thrive despite the harsh conditions. Estelle was outside, working in that garden, when he pulled up. She was a small woman, thin and wiry, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She watched him approach with sharp eyes that missed nothing, leaning on her hoe like a staff. "Officer Boone," she said, before he could introduce himself. "I heard about Emmett's sheep. Terrible thing." "How did you hear about it, Mrs. Dyer? It just happened this morning." She smiled slightly. "Sound travels far in the desert, officer. Especially sounds of distress. I heard Emmett's shout when he found them. 4:17 this morning, to be exact." Marshall found it hard to believe she could have heard anything from 5 miles away, but he let it pass. "Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Any strangers, vehicles, lights?" Estelle set down her hoe and motioned for him to follow her to the porch. She poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher without asking if he wanted any, and sat in an old rocking chair that creaked rhythmically. "Officer Boone, I've lived here for 37 years. I've seen things that would make most people pack up and leave. But what's happening now, it's different. It started about a month ago." "What started?" "The offerings," she said simply. "Someone's been leaving offerings at the old sites, the places where the ancient ones used to conduct ceremonies. I found them on my morning walks. Bones arranged in patterns, symbols drawn in ash, things that shouldn't be disturbed being disturbed." "Why didn't you report this?" She laughed, a dry sound like wind through dead leaves. "Report what? That someone's practicing old religions? That's not a crime. But it's not traditional practice either. It's something else, something wrong. They're not honoring the old ways. They're perverting them. Do you have any idea who might be doing this?" Estelle was quiet for a long moment, rocking slowly. "There's been a man coming around. Not from here. He says he's researching traditional practices, but his questions are all wrong. He doesn't want to know about harmony and balance. He wants to know about power and control. He's been to Emmett's place too." "Do you know this man's name?" "He never said, but he drives a white van with out-of-state plates. Colorado, I think. He was here 3 days ago, asking about the old pictographs up in the canyon." Marshall took down all the information and thanked Estelle for her help. As he was leaving, she called out to him. "Officer Boone, be careful. Some things once started can't be easily stopped. And some people, once they taste power, won't give it up willingly." Back at the Tate Ranch, the veterinarian had arrived and was examining the sheep. Dr. Sarah Yazzie was young but experienced, having dealt with numerous livestock deaths over her 5 years with the tribe. But as she examined the carcasses, her expression grew increasingly troubled. "Marshall, I've never seen anything like this," she said, pulling off her latex gloves. "These cuts are precise beyond anything I've encountered. The blood has been completely drained, but I can't find extraction points. And these organs weren't just removed. They were taken with surgical precision that would be difficult to achieve even in a veterinary hospital. Could a person have done this? A person with extensive medical training and specialized equipment, maybe. But out here, in the middle of the night, without leaving any trace, I don't see how. As they were talking, Emmett approached with something in his hand. "Officer, I found this near the fence line. I don't know if it's related." It was a small leather pouch, decorated with beads and symbols. Marshall recognized it as a medicine bundle, but like the symbols on the sheep, it felt wrong somehow. The patterns were similar to traditional designs, but subtly different, as if someone had tried to recreate them from memory without understanding their meaning. That evening, Marshall set up surveillance at the Tate Ranch with Emmett's permission. He parked his cruiser where he had a clear view of the pasture and settled in for what he expected to be a long, uneventful night. Emmett had moved his remaining livestock to a pen closer to the house, and the mutilated sheep had been removed for further examination. Around midnight, something changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a fog rolled in despite the clear sky. Marshall's radio started producing static, and his cell phone lost signal. The air felt charged, like before a thunderstorm, but no storm was forecast. At 12:47 a.m., he saw lights in the pasture. Not flashlights or headlights, but soft, blue-white orbs that seemed to float above the ground. They moved in patterns, circling the area where the sheep had been found. Marshall grabbed his flashlight and weapon and moved closer on foot. As he approached, the lights suddenly went out. The fog was so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. Then he heard it, chanting, low, rhythmic, in a language he didn't recognize. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He moved toward the sound, his flashlight beam barely penetrating the fog. In the center of the pasture, where the sheep had been arranged, he saw a figure. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like traditional ceremonial robes, but wrong. The patterns inverted, the colors off. The man was kneeling, placing objects on the ground in a precise pattern. "Police, stop what you're doing and show me your hands," Marshall commanded. The figure didn't acknowledge him, continuing the chanting. Marshall moved closer, and as he did, he realized the objects being placed were organs. Fresh organs, still glistening with moisture. The same organs that had been taken from the sheep. "I said stop!" Marshall drew his weapon. The man finally looked up, and Marshall's blood ran cold. The face was human, but wrong. The eyes were completely black, no whites visible. The mouth was twisted in an expression that might have been a smile or a grimace. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "You're too late, officer. The boundary is already weakening. They're already starting to cross over." "Who's crossing over? What are you talking about?" The man stood slowly, his movements fluid and unnatural. "The old ones. The ones who were here before. They never left, you know. They just waited. And now someone has finally learned how to invite them back." Marshall kept his weapon trained on the man. "Put your hands where I can see them, and get on the ground." The man laughed, a sound that seemed to echo from the fog itself. "You think your gun matters here? You think your laws apply? This is older than your nation, older than any nation. This is about power that existed before humans walked upright." The fog suddenly thickened, and Marshall lost sight of the man. He heard movement circling him, but every time he turned his flashlight toward the sound, there was nothing there. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the fog lifted. The man was gone. The organs were gone. The only evidence that anything had happened was a new symbol burned into the grass where the man had been kneeling. This symbol Marshall recognized. It was a warning in the old language, one his grandmother had shown him once. It meant door, or gateway. He searched the area until dawn, but found nothing, no tracks, no vehicle, no trace of the mysterious man. When he returned to his cruiser, he found something that made his hands shake. On his windshield, drawn in what looked like ash, was a message. "The seventh night brings the opening." Marshall reported everything to his superiors, but without evidence beyond his testimony, there was little they could do. They increased patrols in the area and warned ranchers to secure their livestock. But Marshall knew it wouldn't be enough. Over the next 3 nights, more mutilations occurred. Each time, 7 animals arranged in a circle, organs precisely removed, symbols burned into their hides. Each time, the symbols were slightly different, as if counting down to something. The ranchers were panicking, some abandoning their properties altogether. On the 6th night, Marshall visited Estelle Dyer again. She was sitting on her porch despite the late hour, as if waiting for him. "You saw him, didn't you?" she said without preamble. "The one who's doing this. How do you know?" "Because you have the look of someone who's seen behind the veil. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it." She stood, moving with surprising agility for her age. "Come with me." She led him into her house, to a room he hadn't seen before. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. It was a chronicle of strange events going back decades. Unexplained lights, missing persons, livestock mutilations, all centered on this area. "This has happened before," she said, "in every 33 years like clockwork. Someone discovers the old writings, thinks they can control the power and tries to open the door. Usually, they fail. The rituals are too complex, require too much precision. But this time is different." "Different how?" "This time, they're doing it right. Each mutilation is a key, unlocking another seal. 7 seals in total. Tomorrow night is the 7th night." Marshall studied the wall of information. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. "How do we stop it?" Estelle turned to him with sad eyes. "I don't know if we can. But I know where it will happen. There's a place about 10 miles north of here where the ley lines converge. The ancient ones called it the Speaking Circle. That's where he'll try to complete the ritual." The next night, Marshall wasn't alone. He'd convinced 2 other officers to join him, though he hadn't told them the full truth. They thought they were preventing vandalism and livestock theft. They had no idea what they were really walking into. They reached the Speaking Circle just after midnight. It was a natural amphitheater in the rock, with stone formations that created an almost perfect circle. In the center was the man Marshall had seen before, but now he wasn't alone. There were others, maybe a dozen, all wearing the same inverted ceremonial robes, all chanting in unison. 7 cattle lay in the familiar circle, but these were still alive, though barely. They'd been drugged or somehow paralyzed, their eyes rolling in terror. The group was preparing for the final cut, the final sacrifice that would complete the ritual. "This ends now," Marshall shouted, moving forward with his weapon drawn. The lead figure turned to him, those black eyes reflecting the moonlight. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The door is opening. They are coming through." That's when Marshall saw it. The air in the center of the circle was shimmering, like heat waves but wrong. Through the shimmer, he could see something else, another place that shouldn't exist. And in that place, things were moving. Large things. Hungry things. One of the other officers fired. Whether at the cultists or at what he saw through the shimmer, Marshall never knew. Chaos erupted. The cultists scattered, their chanting disrupted. The paralyzed cattle suddenly thrashed to life, breaking the circle as they fled in terror. The shimmer in the air began to pulse erratically. The lead cultist screamed in rage, trying to complete the ritual, but it was too late. The carefully constructed pattern was broken. The door that had been opening slammed shut with a sound like thunder, but not before something came through. It was only for a moment, a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist in this world. Multiple eyes, too many limbs, a mouth that opened in dimensions that hurt to perceive. It reached for the lead cultist, and in an instant, he was gone. Not dead, just gone. Pulled through the closing gateway into whatever hell he'd been trying to unleash. The other cultists fled into the night. Marshall and his fellow officers were left standing in the speaking circle, trying to process what they'd witnessed. The cattle were gone, scattered into the desert. The only evidence of what had happened was the symbols burned into the rock, symbols that hurt to look at directly. They filed reports, but the official record would only show an attempted livestock theft interrupted by police. The cultists who were caught claimed they were performing historical reenactments and were released on bail. They disappeared before trial, leaving no forwarding addresses. Emmett Tate never lost another animal to mutilation. He sold his ranch 6 months later and moved to Phoenix. He never spoke about what happened, but sometimes, when the conversation turned to strange events, he'd get a distant look and change the subject. Estelle Dyer continued to live on her property, continued to walk the desert paths every morning. She told Marshall that the door was closed but not sealed. It never could be truly sealed, not as long as people remembered how to open it. All they could do was watch and wait for the next time someone tried. Marshall Boone still patrols the area. He's become something of an expert on unusual phenomena, the officer other cops call when things don't make sense. He's prevented 3 more attempts to open doorways, each time arriving just in time to disrupt the ritual. But he knows it's only a matter of time. The knowledge is out there, scattered in old books and hidden websites, passed between those who hunger for power they don't understand. And somewhere, somewhen, someone will succeed in completing the ritual. Late at night, when he's driving the empty roads of the reservation, Marshall sometimes sees lights in the desert that shouldn't be there. He sees shadows moving against the laws of physics, hears chanting carried on winds that blow from nowhere. He knows the barrier between worlds is thin here, has always been thin. The ancient ones knew this. That's why they created the warnings, the symbols that said, "Do not disturb," in every language they could imagine. But people forget. People think old warnings are just superstition, old fears just primitive ignorance. Marshall knows better now. He's seen what waits on the other side of the door, what hungers to cross over. He's dedicated his life to making sure that door stays closed, even if he has to do it alone, even if no one believes him. Because once you've seen behind the veil, once you've glimpsed what lurks in the spaces between spaces, you can never go back to ignorance. You can only stand guard and hope that when the next attempt comes, you'll be there in time to stop it. The mutilations have stopped for now. The cultists have scattered. But Marshall knows they'll be back, or others like them. The hunger for forbidden power is as old as humanity itself, and in the vast emptiness of the desert, where the stars are bright and the boundary between worlds grows thin, that hunger finds fertile ground. He keeps watch. He stays ready, because somewhere out there, someone is reading the old texts, learning the forbidden rituals, preparing to try again. And when they do, Officer Marshall Boone will be waiting. Officer Clayton Frost had been with the Navajo Nation Police for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd learned to trust his instincts. When something felt wrong, it usually was. That's why the wellness check call on that cold October evening immediately set off his internal alarms, even though everything about it seemed routine. The call came from Beatrice Lane, a social worker with the Tribal Elder Services. She was worried about Virgil Stone, an 83-year-old veteran who lived alone in a modest house about 20 miles outside of Window Rock. Virgil hadn't answered his phone in 4 days, hadn't picked up his medication from the pharmacy, and had missed his weekly appointment at the VA clinic. "It's not like him," Beatrice said over the phone, her voice carrying genuine concern. "Virgil is always punctual, always responsible. He survived 2 tours in Vietnam. He doesn't just disappear without telling someone." Clayton knew the area where Virgil lived. It was isolated, a cluster of old houses built in the 70s for returning veterans. Most were abandoned now, their occupants either deceased or moved to be closer to medical facilities. Virgil was one of the last holdouts, stubbornly independent despite his age. The drive out took Clayton through winding roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The October sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. As he turned onto the dirt road that led to Virgil's property, he noticed how quiet everything was. No birds, no insects, just the sound of his cruiser's engine and tires on gravel. Virgil's house sat at the end of the road, a small adobe structure with a metal roof that had seen better days. The front yard was surprisingly well maintained, with native plants arranged in neat rows and decorative rocks forming a path to the front door. Virgil's old Ford pickup was parked in its usual spot, covered in a fine layer of dust that suggested it hadn't moved in days. Clayton parked and approached the house, noting the details that seemed off. The front door was closed, but not fully latched. The window blinds were drawn, unusual for Virgil, who, according to Beatrice, liked to watch the sunrise every morning. Most disturbing was the smell, faint but unmistakable, drifting from somewhere inside. "Mr. Stone," Clayton called out, knocking firmly on the doorframe. "Virgil Stone, this is Officer Frost with the Navajo police. Miss Lane asked me to check on you." No response. The house remained silent except for a faint humming sound, like an old refrigerator struggling to stay cold. Clayton pushed the door open slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. The smell hit him full force as the door swung open. Death, but not recent death. This was older, mixed with something else, something chemical and sharp. The living room was neat, almost obsessively so. Everything was in its place. Magazines aligned perfectly on the coffee table, remote controls arranged by size, shoes lined up by the door with military precision. "Mr. Stone," Clayton called again, moving deeper into the house. The kitchen was equally organized, dishes washed and stacked, counters cleaned, but there was a cup of coffee on the table, full, with mold growing on its surface. Next to it was a newspaper dated 5 days ago, opened to the obituaries. The hallway leading to the bedrooms was dark, the overhead light fixture empty of bulbs. Clayton pulled out his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Family photos lined the walls, showing Virgil through the decades. Young soldier in Vietnam, middle-aged man with a wife and children, elderly veteran at various ceremonies. In recent photos, he was always alone. The first bedroom was set up as an office. Maps covered one wall. Military maps of Vietnam mixed with topographical maps of the reservation. Red pins marked various locations, connected by strings like a conspiracy theorist's web. On the desk was a journal, the last entry dated 4 days ago. Clayton read it, his unease growing with each word. They found me. After all these years, they finally found me. I thought I'd left them in the jungle, but they followed me home. They've been waiting, patient, watching. Tonight, I end this. One way or another, the debt will be paid. The master bedroom door was closed. Clayton could hear something behind it, a rhythmic sound like breathing but not quite. He announced himself one more time, then turned the doorknob. The room was dark, windows covered with heavy blankets nailed to the frames. In the center of the room, Virgil Stone sat in a chair facing the corner. He was wearing his dress uniform, metals polished and aligned perfectly. His hands were folded in his lap, his posture rigid. "Mr. Stone," Clayton said softly, approaching carefully. "Are you all right?" Virgil's head turned slowly, too slowly, like a mechanical doll. When Clayton's flashlight hit his face, he had to suppress a gasp. Virgil's eyes were open but clouded, the whites yellowed and bloodshot. His skin had a grayish pallor, and there were dark veins visible beneath the surface, spreading from his neck like a spider web. "Officer," Virgil said, his voice raspy and distant. "You shouldn't have come. It's not safe here anymore. Mr. Stone, you need medical attention. Let me call an ambulance." "No!" Virgil's voice was suddenly sharp, commanding. "No one else comes here. You need to leave now, before they know you're here." "Before who knows? Mr. Stone, who are you talking about?" Virgil stood up, his movements stiff and unnatural. As he did, Clayton noticed something that made his blood run cold. Virgil's shadow on the wall didn't match his movements. It seemed to have a life of its own, writhing and shifting independently. "The ones I brought back," Virgil whispered. "The ones that crawled inside us in the jungle. We thought we were the survivors, but we were just vessels, carriers. They needed us to bring them here, to spread them." Clayton's hand went to his radio, but it was dead, producing only static. His cell phone showed no signal. The air in the room seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe. "How many?" Virgil asked suddenly, staring at Clayton with those clouded eyes. "How many people have you killed, officer?" "Mr. Stone, I think you're confused. Let me help you." "I killed 43, Virgil continued, as if Clayton hadn't spoken. 43 confirmed. Men with families, with dreams, with souls, and each one left something behind, something that attached itself to me. They're all here now, all of them inside." The shadows in the room began to move more violently, and Clayton realized they weren't shadows at all. They were something else, something that existed in the spaces between light and dark. The temperature dropped rapidly, and frost began forming on the windows despite them being covered. "Mr. Stone, we need to leave. Now." Virgil laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "Leave? I haven't left this room in 4 days. Can't leave. They won't let me. But they're getting stronger, feeding off me. Soon they won't need me anymore." That's when Clayton saw them clearly for the first time. Shapes moving in the corners of the room, humanoid but wrong, composed of darkness so dense it seemed to absorb light. They had features that suggested faces, suggestions of eyes that tracked his movements. "They're hungry," Virgil said, his voice now barely human. "They've been hungry for so long. In the jungle, they fed on death, on fear, on the moment when a soul leaves a body. But here, in this dry place, there's not enough death. So they're making their own." Clayton backed toward the door, but it slammed shut. The handle wouldn't turn. The windows were sealed. He was trapped. The shapes were moving closer, circling like predators. "I tried to starve them out," Virgil continued, his body beginning to convulse. "Stopped eating, stopped drinking. Thought if I died slowly enough, peacefully enough, they'd fade. But they're patient. They've been patient for 40 years. One of the shapes reached out toward Clayton, and where it touched his arm, the skin immediately went numb. Not cold, just absent. Like that part of him had ceased to exist. He pulled away, but more were closing in. "There's only one way," Virgil said, reaching under his chair. He pulled out his service pistol from Vietnam, an old Colt .45. Quick death, violent death. It confuses them, scatters them, gives you a chance to run. Before Clayton could respond, Virgil put the gun to his temple. Tell my children I loved them. Tell them I'm sorry. An officer, run. Run, and don't look back. The gunshot was deafening in the small room. Virgil's body crumpled, and instantly the shadow things recoiled, thrashing wildly. The door burst open, and Clayton didn't need to be told twice. He ran. Behind him, he could hear them following. Not footsteps, but a sound like whispers made of static. He reached his cruiser, fumbled with the keys, and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, he saw them pouring out of the house, dozens of them, more than should have been able to fit in that small room. He floored the accelerator, kicking up a cloud of dust, but they followed, flowing across the desert like liquid darkness. The radio suddenly burst to life, but instead of dispatch, he heard voices. Vietnamese voices, crying, pleading, cursing. Then Virgil's voice, young and terrified. I'm sorry, I had no choice. The cruiser's engine began to sputter. The lights flickered. Clayton could feel them catching up, could feel the numbness spreading from where one had touched him. Then, suddenly, they stopped. Just stopped at some invisible boundary, writhing at the edge of his headlight beams before flowing back toward the house. Clayton didn't stop driving until he reached the main highway. His radio worked again. His cell phone showed full bars. He called for backup, for an ambulance, for anyone who would listen. But when they arrived at Virgil's house an hour later, they found it empty. No body, no blood, no signs of violence. Just an empty house with everything in perfect order, as if Virgil had simply stepped out for a moment. The only evidence that anything had happened was Clayton's testimony and the spreading numbness in his arm that took weeks to fade. The official report listed Virgil Stone as missing, presumed wandered off due to dementia. The house was sealed, his property transferred to his children who lived in Phoenix. They never came to collect anything, said they wanted nothing from that place. Beatrice Lane was devastated. She blamed herself for not checking on Virgil sooner, for not recognizing the signs. She didn't know what signs she should have been looking for, but she felt guilty nonetheless. She retired early, moved to Albuquerque, and never spoke about Virgil Stone again. Clayton was placed on administrative leave pending psychological evaluation. The department psychologist said he'd suffered a traumatic hallucination brought on by finding a decomposed body. But there was no body. There was never a body. Just an absence where Virgil Stone should have been. 3 months later, Clayton was back on duty, but things were different. He could feel them sometimes in the corners of his vision, in the shadows that fell wrong. The numbness in his arm would return during times of stress, spreading like a reminder of what he'd encountered. He researched Virgil's military history, found records of his unit in Vietnam, found reports of strange incidents, unexplained deaths, soldiers who came back changed. There were others like Virgil, veterans who'd isolated themselves, who'd died alone in mysterious circumstances. Always the same pattern: wellness checks, missing bodies, officers who reported impossible things. Clayton started keeping his own journal, documenting the patterns. He found 7 other cases in the Southwest, all Vietnam veterans, all living alone, all vanishing after welfare checks. The officers who'd responded to those calls had similar stories, dismissed as stress reactions or hallucinations. One night, a year after Virgil's disappearance, Clayton returned to the house. It stood empty, windows dark, door sealed with yellow tape that had faded to white. He sat in his cruiser, watching, waiting. Just before dawn, he saw movement in the windows. Shadows that shouldn't exist, shapes that suggested human forms but weren't, and in one window, for just a moment, he saw Virgil Stone, standing at attention in his dress uniform, metals gleaming despite the absence of light. Their eyes met across the distance, and Virgil saluted, a gesture of recognition, of warning, of farewell. Clayton never went back to the house, but he kept track of it. New families would move in, drawn by the low price, the remote location, the privacy. They never lasted more than a month. They'd leave suddenly, often in the middle of the night, refusing to explain why. The house would stand empty again, waiting. 5 years after Virgil's disappearance, the house burned down. Lightning strike, the fire department said, though there had been no storms that night. Clayton drove out to see the ruins. Nothing remained but the foundation and chimney, black scorch marks spreading out in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. But even with the house gone, people reported seeing things in that area. Shadows moving across the desert at night, following the old roads. Whispers in languages no one recognized. And sometimes, on cold October evenings, like the one when Clayton had responded to that wellness check, people claimed to see an old man in a military uniform, walking the perimeter of where his house once stood, keeping watch. Clayton knows the truth, or at least part of it, that some things come back from war that aren't visible wounds or mental trauma. That sometimes soldiers bring home more than memories, that there are things that feed on death and violence, that attach themselves to those who deal in death, that wait patiently for their chance to spread. He still responds to wellness checks, but now he's careful. He looks for the signs. Isolated veterans, perfect organization, windows covered, shadows that move wrong. When he finds them, he doesn't go in alone. He calls for backup, waits for daylight, takes precautions that seem paranoid to other officers but that might, just might, save their lives. Because he knows what Virgil knew, what those other missing veterans knew. That some battles don't end when the war does. Some enemies follow you home, patient and hungry, waiting for the right moment to claim what they believe they're owed. The VA has started a new program for isolated veterans, regular check-ins, community support, anything to keep them from being alone too long. They say it's for mental health, for suicide prevention. But Clayton knows there are other reasons, other dangers that no one wants to acknowledge officially. Late at night, when he's on patrol and passes through areas where veterans live alone, he sometimes feels them watching. Not the veterans, but the things they brought back. The shadows that feed on isolation and guilt and the weight of deaths carried for decades. He drives a little faster through those areas now. Doesn't stop unless he has to. Doesn't look too long into the darkness, because he remembers Virgil's words. They're patient. They've been patient for 40 years. And he wonders how many more are out there, how many veterans are sitting alone in dark rooms, fighting battles no one else can see, holding back things that should have stayed in foreign jungles. The welfare check that went wrong taught Clayton that some doors shouldn't be opened, some wellness can't be checked, and some people are alone for reasons that have nothing to do with choice. They're alone because they're protecting others from what they carry, from what followed them home, from what waits in the shadows of their guilt. Virgil Stone is still listed as missing. His children never talk about him. Beatrice Lane still has nightmares about making that call, about sending Clayton to that house. And Clayton himself carries the weight of knowing that there are things in this world that shouldn't exist, that feed on violence and death, that sometimes come home with our soldiers. He continues his work, protecting and serving, but now with the added knowledge that some threats come from places no training can prepare you for. Some enemies wear no uniform, have no body, exist in the spaces between light and shadow, and sometimes the best thing you can do is run. The house is gone, but the land remembers. New plants don't grow there. Animals avoid it. And on certain nights when the conditions are right, when the darkness is deep enough, you can still see them. The shadows that shouldn't exist, circling the empty lot, searching for something that isn't there anymore. Or maybe searching for someone new to attach to, someone else to carry them, someone else to feed on until they're strong enough to not need a host anymore. Until they can walk freely in this world, spreading from person to person, trauma to trauma, death to death. Clayton Frost still serves, still protects. But he knows now that some things can't be protected against. Some things can only be recognized, avoided, contained. And sometimes, like Virgil Stone proved with his final act, the only escape is the one that scatters them temporarily, confuses them just long enough for others to get away. The welfare check that turned deadly wasn't just about one old veteran and the officer who tried to help him. It was about the things we bring home from war, the shadows that attach to those who deal in death, and the price that some pay to keep those shadows from spreading. Virgil Stone might be missing, but his sacrifice wasn't in vain. He showed Clayton the truth, gave him the knowledge to recognize the signs, to protect others from what lurks in the shadows of isolation and guilt. And sometimes, in a job where you see the worst of humanity, knowing that there are worse things than humans is oddly comforting. Because at least humans can be understood, arrested, stopped. But the things that came back from the jungle with Virgil Stone and others like him? They can only be endured, contained, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, escaped. The wellness check continues. Officers still respond to concerns about elderly veterans living alone. But now they know to look for the signs, to be careful, to not go in alone when the shadows seem wrong. Because Virgil Stone's story, officially missing, unofficially something much darker, serves as a warning.